Welcome to today's webinar. County Health Rankings and Roadmaps is a program of the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. This webinar is brought to you thanks to the contributions of colleagues and partners in Wisconsin and across the nation, with support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It is produced in collaboration with Healthy Places by Design, an organization that advances community-led action and proven strategies to ensure health and well-being for all. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejob since time immemorial. UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. This webinar will be recorded. All speakers' views are their own. Guest bios and slides from today's webinar are available on our resource page. We will share a link to the resource page when the webinar begins. Stay up to date on all things CHR&R. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And if you haven't already, sign up for our newsletter by scanning this QR code with your phone's camera. It's the best way to find out about upcoming webinars, our podcast, and our latest tools and resources. Your facilitators today include our host, Erica Burrows-Girardi, with support from CHR&R Communication Specialist, Colleen Wick, and the Collaborative Learning Director from Healthy Places by Design, Joanne Lee. We invite you to continue the conversation immediately after the webinar in our discussion group. Joanne Lee will be our lead facilitator. And watch for a chat from Colleen for details on how to join the group after the webinar.
Welcome to Engaging Across Differences, Constructive Dialogue for Civic Health. Hi, my name is Erica Burrows-Girardi. Since February, we've been meditating on this truth. In a democracy, everyone has a voice in deciding how our society is structured. An inclusive democracy creates opportunities for every person to participate actively in shaping the conditions that affect our lives. And as we build a world where everyone belongs, we ensure that everyone has equal voice in deciding how systems and institutions function. We're going to continue to explore opportunities to live out this truth with today's webinar and actually our webinar next month. Now I want to introduce you to others who are going to be joining you in your learning experience today. And I'm going to start with Joanne Lee with Healthy Places by Design. Hi, Joanne. How are you?
Hello, Erica, and hello to everybody in the audience today. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. It's going to be a great one. The topic is just something that I think will not only be really interesting, but practical. So during today's live webinar, I will be monitoring the Q&A box. So you can go ahead and open the Q&A box. And as questions come to mind for our speaker, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. You don't have to wait until our presentation is over. Just go ahead and put your question in the box, and I will be keeping tabs on those. Another way to engage with us during the webinar is through chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Colleen Wick to tell us how to use the chat.
Thanks, Joanne. Hi, everyone. Good to have you join us all today. Like Joanne said, I will be monitoring the chat. So just use the chat to share any remarks or respond to questions we may ask you during the webinar. Our chat conversations tend to be very engaging. So if you're bothered by the chat, you could just exit out of the chat window in Zoom. If you have any questions for the panelists, please do use the Q&A box, just as Joanne described. And now I would like to pass it on to our technologist, Erin.
Thanks, Colleen. It's always good to be here with you all. If you have any questions or problems seeing the slides or problems hearing, please send us a message in the Q&A box so we can help you with any of your technology needs. Now I'll turn it over to our host, Erica.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thanks to our production team because they're always so good in helping us stay engaged with our webinar. So thank you so much, guys. You know, this year, County Health Rankings National Findings Report focused on civic health. Why? Well, Research shows that people and places thrive when all residents have the chance to participate in their communities. I encourage you to read the National Findings Report to learn more about how civic health can influence our physical and our mental health. And there's going to be a link to the National Findings Report on your resource guide. And as you know, you get those resource guides tomorrow. So, civic participation is a critical element of civic health. And simply put, civic participation is the way that people participate in the life of a community to improve conditions and shape the community's future. So you might be asking, what does civic participation look like? Well, think of activities like volunteering, joining neighborhood groups, donating to causes, participating in the census. And you're probably thinking of other ways that you can participate in your community. Well, those are all facets of civic participation. And another way that we see civic participation lived out is through political and electoral activities like voting, attending rallies, organizing, and running for office. The question is, why does civic participation matter to equity? Well, we make progress toward health equity when all people, not some people, but all people can be heard and have meaningful involvement in decision-making processes. But I think we can all agree that in today's America, having all voices heard has been a little bit challenging. In fact, the political polarization we're experiencing across the country sometimes limit opportunities for people to participate civically in a community. And this means that we must work together. Yes, you and I, those of us who are equity advocates, must work together to foster civic participation so that way people feel welcomed and included, so that their voices are heard and respected. And one way to support this effort is through a technique called bridging. Bridging is described as a practice of two or more individuals or groups coming together and acknowledging that there's differences between them. They affirm their own unique identities, but in finding common ground, they respect each other and they forge a new shared identity. As explained by the University of California's Othering and Belonging Institute, and I quote, bridging calls on us to engage in healthy dialogue and requires us to listen deeply. I like to think about bridging this way. Bridging rejects the idea of them and those people, but embraces the idea of we and us. And, engaging with others who are different than us allows us to grow. You probably know this. To learn, we learn more about others when we engage in bridging. We learn about others' needs, their strengths, their challenges, and we also learn about their opportunities. Surprisingly, though, bridging also helps us to learn more about ourselves, like the values that we hold, the values that are at the heart of our thoughts and actions. And most importantly, bridging allows us to make space for civic participation. And remember, civic participation advances equity. So, to help us learn more about how we can engage others who are different than us, we are fortunate to have the co founder and executive director of the Constructive Dialogue Institute. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Mehl. Hi, Caroline, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Erica. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, we are so fortunate to have you. So thank you so much. These are the questions that we're going to explore with Caroline today. What does the research say about how humans process information? And what is needed to engage in constructive dialogue? And what are the resources to start constructive dialogues? Ultimately, we hope that you'll see that constructive dialogue is one of the best ways that you can organize stakeholders around advancing equity. And so with that, I want to remind you about our post-webinar discussion group because this is going to be the place where we're going to unpack all of this good information that we're going to hear today. Please plan to continue the discussion with us. And during the video intro, you heard Colleen tell us about how the discussion groups immediately follow the webinar. They're facilitated by our friend here, Joanne Lee, and they're always very engaging. Those of you who come monthly, you know this. It gives you the opportunity to share from others and learn from others, and just stay tuned because Colleen is going to chat out the information at the end of the webinar so you can link to the discussion group. I'm also happy to say that Caroline is going to join us in today's discussion group as well. So with that, Caroline, let me just bring you back to the mic, and I want to get into this really, really rich discussion with you that I'm so excited that we're going to have with our audience today. Let me start by asking you, why did you co-found the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and what is your primary focus or work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I co-founded the organization with the psychologist Jonathan Haidt in the aftermath of the 2016 US presidential election. John and I were growing deeply concerned about rising polarization and social division and the impact that we saw it was having in our society. And so, as an example of that, a recent survey from Ipsos found that 64% of Americans have lost faith in American democracy, and 70% of Americans believe the country is in crisis and at risk of failing. And more people no longer just disagree with one another. We see that people really see the other side as immoral and dangerous. And we've grown so far apart that we've lost the ability to understand one another. It's almost as though we're speaking two totally separate languages. And what's really dangerous about this situation is that if we're unable to understand one another, we're not really capable of working together to solve our collective challenges.
Yeah.
And so John and I, we were really concerned about these issues. And what we recognized was there was all this great, rich research in the behavioral sciences that helped us make sense of, why are we so deeply divided? Why do we have this tendency, as you referenced earlier, to think in this, us versus them terms? But even though there's all this research about why we have these divisions and what we can do to overcome them, to a large extent, this research is trapped in the ivory tower. So we saw this opportunity to bring that research to life by translating it into educational tools that are engaging, evidence-based, practical, and scalable in order to disseminate these insights far and wide.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that idea in mind, we co-founded the organization, the Constructive Dialogue Institute, or CDI for short. And we are a national nonprofit that builds educational tools to equip Americans with the skills to communicate and collaborate across differences. And we work with many different types of institutions all over the country. We work with institutions of higher education, we work with high schools, workplaces, religious communities, and local governments. And in all of our work, our goal is to really help these institutions build cultures where people recognize our shared humanity, embrace our differences as strengths, and work together to solve our collective challenges. And over the last few years, since launching in 2017, we've reached more than 60,000 learners all across the country, serving more than 1,000 different institutions.
One of the things that you just said that I really, really liked is that you embrace our differences are our strengths. That is just so beautifully said, and I'm thinking about that. Our differences are our strength. But yet, so many people are finding themselves in conflict and disagreeing on even basic facts. So, can you share more about what the research says? Like, why does that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a problem that unfortunately many of us have been experiencing more and more over the last few years. And to a large extent, our inability to see eye to eye with one another stems from the way that our brains work. So in many ways, our ancient brains are poorly suited for our modern environment. And what I mean by that is that we evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago for life in a completely different context and environment. And to help us survive, our brains developed mental shortcuts to process information incredibly quickly. And we still use these shortcuts today to make sense of the world around us. But the problem is that in today's environment, these shortcuts can often lead us astray, and they can lead us to make predictable and consistent mistakes in our judgment and decision making. So let me explain a little bit more about what this means. Have you ever experienced this feeling of being internally divided about something, almost as though you're being pulled in two different directions?
Yeah, I have.
Well, you're not alone. This is really fundamental to who we are as human beings. And psychologists have found that, a key truth in psychology is that our minds are divided into parts that sometimes conflict. And we've all experienced this in some way before, right? Like we have that experience of, having that deep desire to eat that extra cookie, though, our the other side of ourselves knows that we're like later going to be kicking ourselves because it's almost summer and beach season. But we also know, much to our regret, how powerless we can be in these moments to actually control those feelings and impulses. And so the question is, why does this happen?
Mm-hmm.
And as psychologists have found, there really are two different systems in the mind that sometimes work together seamlessly and sometimes conflict. So the first system is often known as automatic thinking. So automatic thinking is all of our processes that happen quickly, unconsciously, automatically. And this is also where our emotions and intuitions fall. So you can think about this system as our autopilot mode. This is all the actions that we do throughout the day without even thinking about it. For example, every time we blink, this is our automatic thinking at work. Or when we brush our teeth and we're not really thinking about it, it's this autopilot mode. And another example of this is if I asked you to calculate 2 times 2, the answer would just, pop into your head automatically. You wouldn't need to think about what the answer is. But in contrast, we have a second system that's known as controlled thinking. So controlled thinking works very differently. Controlled thinking is much slower, it's conscious, it's effortful, and this is also where more of our logical thinking and higher reasoning happens. So for example, if I asked you to calculate, 57 times 36, for most of us, the answer wouldn't pop into our heads automatically. We need to work out the math. And so these two systems are constantly operating all the time. And usually they're working together hand in hand. And so we're not really aware of them. But sometimes they come into these conflicts. And that's when we experience those moments of feeling like we're being pulled in 2 different directions. Now, there's a useful metaphor to help us remember these two systems in the mind and how they work together. And the metaphor was developed by my co-founder, John Haidt. So the metaphor is that we can think about the mind as being like a small human rider sitting on top of a large elephant. And in this metaphor, the rider represents our controlled thinking, which is our slow, conscious, deliberate, effortful reasoning. And the elephant represents our quick, automatic thinking. So that's our, all those fast, intuitive processes. And what's important about this metaphor is that it helps us remember the relative distribution of power between these two systems. And so what I mean by that is that we often think of ourselves as highly rational. So we'd like to think that it's our rider that's in control, our controlled, more logical reasoning. But in fact, it's our automatic thinking, our powerful, fast, intuitive, emotional thinking that is actually dominating our decision-making, our interpretation of events, and our judgments and reasoning. And so if you think about, a small human rider sitting on top of a large elephant, the rider has the capacity to think further into the future, to plan, right? So let's say you can set a plan. I want to set a certain diet over the next couple of months. That's the controlled thinking. But as we, move about our lives and we see these tasty treats, and we feel that impulse to go in the different direction, or we made the plan to go to the gym, but we're saying like, I'd rather stay home and watch Netflix. That feeling, those impulses that can be really powerful and take us off course, that's the land of the elephant, or automatic thinking. And again, we all know from experience how powerful this can be, because the elephant has a 6-ton advantage over our rider. And this leads to an important process in how our reasoning works. So most of the time when we're moving about the world, we're constantly encountering tons of different new information. We're being inundated by different stimulus all the time, and our minds need to make sense of this. And so, in order to make sense of everything that we're seeing, our brains work at lightning speed to immediately make some kind of pattern match about like, what is that we're seeing? What does this mean? And that system that's working incredibly quickly is, again, that automatic thinking. And this is where we have our intuitions and emotions. So anytime that we see something, we have this automatic flash of instinct of, approach, avoid, like, dislike, and we're doing this constantly. And then what happens is that our slower process, our controlled thinking, comes along and often creates what are known as post hoc justifications to justify our initial intuitions that we had about a particular topic or a particular issue. And these processes happen so quickly and so seamlessly that we're left with the illusion of having carefully reasoned our way to that particular conclusion, when in fact, what's usually happening is we have this automatic reaction and then we justify it after the fact. And this impacts all of our thinking, decision-making, and reasoning. And so you can think of this as, our intuitions come first, our reasoning comes second. And these two systems also lead to a variety of what are known as cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are these consistent, predictable errors in our thinking and reasoning that we're all prone to. And there are hundreds of different types of cognitive biases that are constantly impacting our thinking. But one that's really relevant for this discussion, and that many of you have probably heard over the last few years, is what's known as confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that supports what we already believe. And so the reason why this is relevant is that when you have two different people will have different intuitions. And so when you're talking about a particular topic, especially polarizing topics that people have strong feelings about, when the topic comes up, different people will have different initial strong intuitions about the topic, which will lead them to lean in one direction or the other. And then their writers will create these post hoc justifications to defend it. And so that's why you have, two different people looking at the exact same set of facts and reaching completely different conclusions.
Yeah, that's helpful to know. And thank you for sharing all the research behind that, because I think a lot of us have been asking, like, how can you see these set of facts and yet the interpretation of them are just so different. So I appreciate that. And one way to manage this, right, these differences, is to have a constructive dialogue. So what does constructive dialogue look like?
Yeah, so we define constructive dialogue as a form of conversation where people with different perspectives try to understand each other without giving up our own beliefs in order to work together. So in a lot of ways, our definition of constructive dialogue is very similar to bridging, which you described at the beginning of this webinar. And I just really want to focus on that middle piece of without giving up on their own beliefs. And the reason that I want to call attention to that is that, very often when people hear about this idea of like bridging or dialogue, they worry that it's about, this kumbaya moment, all of us just coming together, forgetting our differences, papering over them, or this feeling like I need to give up something that I hold dear. And we're very clear that that's not what constructive dialogue is about. It's about, recognizing that people have strong principles, convictions, and values that they care deeply about. And it's about moving forward in conversation while maintaining those convictions, but also focusing on listening and understanding others. And so constructive dialogue isn't anything fancy or formal. It's really just about, it's a description of conversation that's focused on people rooted in a desire to understand and connect with others in order to move forward together in some way. And so dialogue can be constructive, whether it's in a one-on-one conversation or a group conversation. You could have a moderator, but you don't need to have a moderator. And these techniques are really useful in any type of context, whether you're talking to friends, family members, colleagues. It's the same techniques, because at the end of the day, it's all about interacting with other human beings and recognizing how our innate psychology operates.
Yeah. And for what I understand, there are actually principles to constructive dialogue. Can you share what those principles are?
Yeah, sure. So we've synthesized all the behavioral science research about this topic, and we've created 5 key principles of constructive dialogue. So I'm happy to share what the 5 are and talk a little bit about the science behind them.
Okay.
So the first principle is let go of winning. And so what I mean by this is that very often when we encounter some kind of disagreement, or, imagine you are talking to someone who holds the exact opposite beliefs than you on a really important topic. For most of us, we have this impulse to enter into the conversation in what we think of as a warrior mindset. So we are coming in prepared to defeat our opponents at all costs, win the argument, and defend our views no matter what. And the problem is that when we enter disagreements or difficult conversations in this way, we're sending an important signal to the other person that this is a battle. And so the other person is going to respond in the same way. They're going to, get defensive, and they're also going to, gear up for battle and be offensive. And so in this type of mode, it's really, really unlikely that the conversation is going to be productive. It's not likely that you're going to persuade the other person. And oftentimes conversations can really, unravel, and it can lead to ruptured relationships. But rather than going into conversations in this way, we encourage people to enter conversations in what we refer to as an explorer mindset, where you let go of winning the argument and you instead embrace this idea that this is an exploration. It's an opportunity for you to learn, to understand someone else. You can approach the conversation with curiosity. And if anything, very often when we meet people that we don't agree with, we have this question of like, how could they possibly think that? And so this is the opportunity to, turn that on its head into a positive question of, how could they possibly think that? Let me get curious and try to find out. And so that also, leads to the next principles, which is to share your story and invite others to do the same. So again, many of us, when we are talking about a controversial topic, we think to ourselves, well, if I come prepared with the strongest case possible, I'm going to come with all of the facts, all of the evidence, and I'm going to basically, hit the other person over the head with them. And if I do this, how could the person not change their mind, right? We expect that the other person is just going to accept what we tell them and suddenly update their beliefs to think the same way as us. But of course, we all know from experience that this very, very rarely happens. And the research tells us that trying to persuade people with facts alone, especially when you're challenging their deeply held beliefs, especially when those deeply held beliefs are wrapped up in their core sense of selves and identity, very, very rarely actually changes their mind. And oftentimes it can actually make people even more deeply entrenched in what they believed at the outset. And so, the question is then, how do you move forward? And the research tells us that a much more effective approach for changing hearts and minds is appealing to people's emotions and intuitions. So going back to what we were talking about just a few moments ago, the problem is that we often focus on people's riders, on people's controlled thinking. And instead, you have to first appeal to their elephant, to their automatic thinking, to their emotions and intuitions. And by appealing first to people's emotions and intuitions, it makes them far more likely to listen to what you have to say, for you to resonate with them. And so an effective way of doing that is by engaging in storytelling. Storytelling, especially if you're telling stories that are powerful in terms of their emotions, can be a really, really effective way of opening people up to consider things that they wouldn't have considered previously. Now, the third principle is to ask questions to understand. So question asking is something that, we all kind of take for granted. We all think like, I know how to ask a question, of course. But, not all questions are created equally. There are, questions that can be really constructive and that can open people up. And there are questions that are, kind of like gotcha questions that aren't really meant to actually learn about another person, that aren't really intended in the spirit of curiosity. They're really meant to, put the other person off guard. And so it's really important and effective to ask questions that are really sincerely intended to understand the other person. And by doing this, you're really accomplishing two things. The first is that you yourself will start to learn new information. You'll start to understand, well, where is this person coming from? Why do they believe what they believe? And it might open up a whole new world of understanding that was missing before. And the second thing that's really important is that we as human beings have this natural urge to reciprocate. And so if someone asks you questions, if someone starts to express, sincere curiosity about you, you feel that and you start to feel the urge to do the same. And so if you express curiosity about other people, they're much more likely to then, reciprocate and be curious and ask you questions about what you believe. The fourth principle is to make yourself and others feel heard. So here we talk about, again, this idea, going back to what I was saying about the definition of constructive dialogue, that it's not about saying, nothing that anyone says to me should bother me and I should just, suck it up, whatever someone says, I shouldn't be upset. It's really important that you express yourself, you make yourself feel heard. And if someone says something that, is upsetting to you, or they do or say something that's offensive or is wrong to you in some way, it's important for you to be able to express that. And again, there are techniques that will allow you to do this very effectively so that the other person is more receptive to you expressing yourself versus a lot of the ways that we typically do this, which can go poorly. And lastly, by making other people feel heard, we're much more likely to, again, have them reciprocate and show us that type of respect. And so the last principle is, when possible, seek common ground. So finding common ground isn't always possible, but if you can, it's a really, really important step in building trust and creating the opportunity to build on for further conversations. And so common ground can look like a lot of different things. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily agree. Very often you won't agree. But if you specifically look for, where are the areas where we are agreeing? Do we have, shared sense of values here? Like, are we both really prioritizing education, family, the well-being of our society, whatever it might be, finding those types of, common values, or maybe you're debating some kind of policy and you recognize, well, maybe we share the same goal of what we're trying to accomplish, or maybe we agree on this part of the policy, but we disagree here. Being able to identify those areas where we actually do agree can be really powerful, because we often do share a lot more in common with others than we initially realize. And by focusing on those areas of common ground, it lays the foundation for ongoing trust and the opportunity for collaboration.
I couldn't agree more. And as I look through these principles, I can definitely see how constructive dialogues can be used to engage stakeholders in conversations about equity. If we let go of winning, if we share these powerful stories and ask questions to understand where people's sticking points are with equity. What is it that they don't understand? Is it the terminology? Is it these narratives that we hear that if we create a society where everyone has, opportunity to be healthy, that someone is going to suffer? Like, what is it that's keeping people from seeing the value in advancing equity? So I can definitely see that. And I hope you and the audience can see how you can use these principles to begin engaging both champions of equity and people who may have questions about equity. And but Caroline, I want to ask you this question, because there's been some valid criticism, I think, about bridging techniques, that sometimes they don't take power into account. And for example, John A. Powell gives this example about how it might be challenging for employees to engage in a constructive dialogue with their supervisors, or a group of residents living in a neighborhood that's layered with inequities to engage with residents from affluent neighborhoods. So how should we engage when there are power imbalances like this?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And I just want to be clear that constructive dialogue isn't sufficient to solve every problem in every context. You can think of it as one tool within your toolbox. So for example, if there's been an abuse of power, dialogue is likely not enough. You might need to appeal to the relevant authority to help you take appropriate action. But for situations that don't rise to that level, constructive dialogue has been proven to be the most effective method for changing hearts and minds. And I'd love to share a story that can illustrate this example. So Daryl Davis is a well-known civil rights activist and blues musician. And over the last few decades, he's single-handedly led more than 200 members of the KKK to leave the Klan. Wow. And how did he do it? He established personal relationships with Klan members and had deep conversations with them over time. And so I'm by no means suggesting that anyone on this webinar should go out and start befriending Klan members. But what we can learn from this is that if Daryl Davis can do such, unbelievable work in the most extreme circumstances, we can use those same techniques in our day-to-day lives to navigate our differences, which are, usually not as severe as this type of experience. And so I'd love to just share a brief quote from Daryl Davis describing his approach. So he says, "You challenge them, but you don't challenge them rudely or violently. You do it politely and intelligently. And when you do things that way, chances are they will reciprocate and give you a platform." So Roger Kelly, the Klan leader, and I would sit down and listen to one another over a period of time. And the cement that held his ideas together began to get cracks in it. And then it began to crumble, and then it fell apart. And so
Wow.
you can already start to see there are all these similarities between what Gerald Davis describes as his technique for approaching these incredibly difficult conversations and those key principles of dialogue, this idea of reciprocity, of deep listening, of showing respect. These can be really, really powerful tools in really opening up people to different ways of thinking.
Yeah. And one thing that sticks out about what you said is that this was multiple conversations. It wasn't like a one and done, like we're gonna have a community meeting and now everyone's gonna be on the same page. So it's all about building those relationships over time and building that trust. And that can't be done in one sitting.
Absolutely.
So, speaking of that, how does constructive dialogue facilitate belonging and inclusion?
Yeah, so constructive dialogue is really all about making space for differences and finding ways to live, learn, and work with people who are different from you. And it helps foster belonging and inclusion by really focusing on principles about, treating others with dignity and respect, making others feel heard, helping people connect in authentic ways, and again, helping people identify areas that are shared, whether it's, common experiences, common interests, common values, and focusing on those differences, focusing on those commonalities despite our differences.
And what types of tools and resources does the Institute offer, and how have groups used them?
Yeah, so we offer a set of uh, resources that can be tailored or that are tailored for all the different audiences that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. And our suite of tools focuses on three key types of tools. So the first is e-learning. We have an e-learning platform called Perspectives that teaches those key concepts that we started to talk about today about the inner workings of the mind, how we process information, where our values come from, and how we form our worldviews. And then it teaches evidence-based practices for how people can engage in constructive dialogue. The second main offering that we have is professional development. So professional development is live and asynchronous training for people like managers or professors or teachers to equip them with the skills they need to be able to create spaces that support open dialogue, to help them gain the skills to moderate difficult conversations and intervene if conversations start to, get heated. And then the third key tool that we offer is analytics. So we have assessments that track whether or not our tools are actually bringing about the effects that we're looking at, and it helps people recognize how am I and my community improving on these metrics over time. And that actually leads me to a little bit about our research. So as an organization, we are deeply committed to research. It's really like fundamental to our organizational DNA. And research plays a role in our organization in a lot of different ways. So the first is obviously, I've been talking a lot about the underlying research that informs the content that we teach, but we also conduct academic research on an ongoing basis to evaluate the effectiveness of our tools and then constantly iterate and improve them based on the results. And so we've conducted research over the last 5 years with more than 50,000 learners. And we've conducted 2 randomized controlled trials, which is, we're basically putting our tools to the same kind of level of rigor that you would do with a clinical trial, where we are randomly assigning groups to either be in a control condition or an experimental condition, where they're taking our tools and they're completing the same assessments over the same periods of time. And our research has found that our program is highly effective in reducing polarization, increasing intellectual humility, which is the willingness to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and the possibility of being wrong. It leads to improvement in perspective taking, openness to diverse perspectives, and it also leads to improvement in negative conflict behavior. So an improvement in conflict resolution skills.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And an example of how we've worked with a company is we've been working with a company called Allegis Group for the last 5 years. And we've worked with them in a variety of different ways. So the first is that one of their subsidiary companies called Tech Systems has been using our online training in their leadership development programs for more than 5 years. So rising stars in the company are going through our training to gain these fundamental skills for how they can communicate and collaborate more effectively with others. The second application is that Tech Systems has now made our programming available company-wide, so every single employee at the company can access our tools and gain these types of skills. And then the third example is that another one of Allegis' subsidiary companies has been starting to use our online program in their employee onboarding. So the idea is that all new employees, when they get to the company, they go through this experience and they gain this shared language and shared set of skills that they can then refer back to over time that allows them to just navigate differences more effectively, work together more effectively, and it strengthens team cohesion.
Wow. That I love the fact that they're using it for onboarding. So that this kind of sets the foundation for this is how we're going to operate, right? So that's so cool. But it's such a fascinating conversation. Caroline, don't go anywhere because we got questions coming up. But if folks are interested in implementing the curriculum that you're talking about, or they want to access any of your tools or connect with any of your colleagues, what should be the next step?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can visit our website at constructivedialogue.org to learn more. And you can also reach out to our Director of Partnerships, Courtney Bradshaw, at courtney@constructivedialogue.org. And there are a lot of resources, a lot of articles and white papers and tools that you can start to explore.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that was really, really fascinating. So, and thinking about how you might be able to use these strategies in terms of advancing equity, I'm going to ask Erin to launch a poll because I'm curious, could you use these strategies that or these principles with constructive dialogue in your community? So thank you for launching that, Erin. And then in the chat, if you would, tell us any challenges you think you might encounter if you were to implement any of these strategies. I'm just curious. All right. So, Erin, I'm going to ask that you go ahead and close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. That's an anonymous poll, by the way. So we are not sharing the results. We're just kind of asking, just so we'll know for ourselves whether or not you think that you could use those strategies. So thank you for responding to that poll. Joanne, this has been such a fascinating conversation with Caroline. I'm sure we have some questions. So let's see what folks are asking.
Yes, Caroline, you were getting lots of shout outs and ahas in the chat as you were speaking. And I've been trying to keep up with the range of questions. Some of them are similar. So I just want to let the audience know that I tried to group some of the similar questions, but hopefully we can get to most of them. If for any reason we are not able to get to all of the questions that were pitched during this webinar, remember we have the post-webinar discussion group to continue the conversations. So Caroline, I'm going to just go ahead and jump right in, because when you started sharing about the 5 principles for having constructive dialogue, there was a lot of activity in the chat and the Q&A. And a common question had this common theme of, well, what if the person that I'm trying to engage with, or the group that I'm trying to engage with, isn't entering the conversation with using those same principles? So as an example, what if I try to be curious of their views and they're not willing to be curious of me? How do we move forward? How do I stay open and curious if the other person's views are patently offensive or even racist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's, an issue that all of us face all the time, because you can't control anyone's actions other than your own. But I would say that, again, the research is pretty clear that these techniques can be very effective. They don't always work. And it's important to recognize also, as Erica was saying, that, you might have this experience where in one conversation, you don't get very far. And even if you're using all these techniques and you're doing the best you can, the other person might not reciprocate. And that's, very possible, and it can be really frustrating. But if you are having conversations with someone on an ongoing basis, so let's say this is a group that you are working with continuously, or a person that you work with continuously, you can think of this as the long game rather than a sprint, where if you actually have the patience and willpower to say, I'm going to continuously use these practices, you will likely start to see over time that the person will start to reciprocate. And again, this isn't meant to say that it will happen in every situation, because there are extreme cases where other people, again, will never reciprocate. And that can be really challenging. So I'd say that Option one is to just continuously try these tools and see if you start to see movement. The other thing is that in our program, we teach skills for how to exit conversations gracefully or manage these moments where, no, despite your best efforts, the other person isn't participating in the same way. And so, again, there are techniques to do this effectively where we talk about, for example, what we call like an XYZ strategy. So let's say someone says something that you find highly offensive, or they've done something wrong. Rather than just being upset or naming names, a really effective technique is to focus on naming the behavior, the impact, and your needs. And so what I mean by that is, rather than saying like, you always do this, or when you we often talk in these kinds of extreme or exaggerated language. And if you say something like, you always do this, or you're an X, the other person will start to fight you on that rather than actually hear what you have to say, because they'll start arguing, I'm not this, how could you call me this? Or they'll start to say, I don't always do this. What about that time last week when I didn't, right? So they'll start arguing. So the goal is to focus on what can you objectively say about the situation that the other person did. So you could say something like, when you said, and you say the exact same language that they said, and then you say, so that's the behavior, describe the behavior. And then the why is, so when you said X, it had Y impact on me. You can say, it made me feel really upset. It hurt me, or whatever else it might be. And then the Z is what I need from you. So you can say really definitively, when you said X, it had this impact on me. And what I need for you going forward is to use more respectful language, or, whatever it might be. But this is just one example of a technique that you can use to really, try to harness your own strength in that moment, and gain control of the conversation when the other person isn't being a good, counter participant in the situation.
Yeah, really great tips, that XYZ. And also you pointed out two other things that are very important is that oftentimes in our work, it's going to take more than one conversation. It's about building a relationship as well. And that constructive dialogue involves two willing parties, right? Yeah, absolutely. Great. So again, on those 5 principles, they're really caught people's attention. Fernando asked a really great question. Our folks in communities are working on a lot. And he asked, how can we implement these principles in what's often, a high pressure, short time frame situation, such as when political decisions or ramifications are being made?
It's tough because, to be honest, a lot of these principles do take more time. If you want to be as quick and efficient as possible, often the way to do that is to use, as few words as possible, to just get to the point as much as possible, to state your case as much as possible. But the challenge is that, very often it won't go anywhere. And, we know from human behavior, if you want to change people, it's hard and it takes time. And so I think that in the short term, again, we often think like, I need to get this done. We have to operate under these tight conditions, or, we have this deadline. I only have 30 minutes, whatever it might be. But the problem is that if you keep thinking that type of scarcity mindset, you're actually probably just compounding the issue over time, because you're not taking the time that you need in the moment to slow things down and have these deeper types of conversations that might take a little bit more time, but might open up new opportunities and capacity. So again, I think it's all about keeping that long game in mind and recognizing that slowing down in the moment might actually speed things up faster, because you might face less resistance in the future.
Thank you. So we have a question from Olivia, and she was interested in what you shared about the perspectives training. Are the findings contingent on people choosing to participate in the program? Are the techniques also effective in settings where people are not voluntarily or intentionally trying to engage in constructive dialogue?
That's a great question. So what I will say about our research is that we know that our findings are consistent regardless of age, gender, political orientation, and race. So that's interesting that we're seeing like so much positive effect regardless of all those key demographic differences. In most cases, people, I guess there's like a little bit of a blend. I'd say that, again, like all these principles that I've been talking about are part of this underlying idea that you can't force people to do something. And when you try to force someone to do something that they don't want to do, it's very unlikely that it's going to go well. And that's really what constructive dialogue is all about. It's about helping people find their own motivation to change, which again, the science tells us is the most effective way to change someone. So I wouldn't recommend trying to force someone who really doesn't want to do this to do it. But, in a lot of circumstances, we work with thousands of students in higher education, for example. And so a lot of the people who are using the program are students who are being assigned this as part of their course. So they're not, opting in to say, they're not saying, oh, I specifically want to do this. I specifically want to learn these tools. Their professors assigning it, but we still see that even in that circumstance, the results are really positive. So I think I don't think it's as specific as you need people to go out of their way to opt in. But I would say that if you're, really mandating this to someone who specifically is resistant to it, I doubt it would go that well just because of everything we know about human nature.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Holly, and she said she does work, her work involves inviting younger people to collaborate and she has trouble with retention of younger people. And she says, even when goals are the same, it feels more like a difference in understanding how to share power, I guess, between adults and younger people. How do we unpack those kinds of differences, and what structural elements of constructive dialogue might help with that, the power dynamics?
That's a great question. So I think that I would really use the power of asking questions in that situation, because even like in that question, there was a question that there's this uncertainty, there's this curiosity of, what's causing this? Why do we have this different dynamic? Why are the students feeling this way? And so I would use that as really an opportunity to explore that and to share power by saying, I want to put you all in the driver's seat. I want to understand where this is coming from. I want to understand your perspectives, and, teasing that out from them through the power of, good questions and deep listening, I think could really help demonstrate to students and young people that you value their perspective, you care about what they have to say, and start to shift that power balance.
So a couple of our webinar attendees were very interested in some of the tools that you mentioned that are available through your organization. Janice asked, is there a cost associated with the tools or particular tools? Kim said, she's really interested in bringing some of the constructive dialogue trainings to her organization's onboarding process. Do you have a specific training package for that purpose?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a lot of different types of packages, and for different types of institutions, there's a different pricing model. So for individual professors or teachers that are interested in using these tools, our tools are completely free. For institutions like an entire campus that wants to partner with us, then we have a campus-wide package that includes all those different things that I mentioned. So the online training, the professional development training for faculty and staff, and the analytics package. And there's a cost associated with it. And similarly, if we work with companies or workplaces, we have there are costs associated, but we have a sliding scale model. So nonprofit organizations, public institutions, and educational institutions have a highly subsidized and reduced cost compared to a for-profit company. And we have a pretty standard package that we can offer to different types of institutions, but then we can also tailor our offering based on what you need. So in some cases, you might say, we just want the online training, and others you might want just the professional development. Sometimes you might want both. And so we work with organizations to really understand their needs and make sure that we're giving them the package that's best suited to their organization.
Great, that's wonderful. All right, so we have two attendees that had questions. I think they were making links between constructive dialogue and restorative justice work. So wanted to see if you could comment on how it might be similar, or how the technique might be used in restorative justice work. Particularly, one attendee said, how do we use this and not place an undue burden on those who have historically been marginalized to start the conversation or reach out and build bridges?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a question that, comes up in different forms a lot. And so I would say that, bringing in people who are not from historically marginalized communities to try to lead these conversations and model these types of conversations can be a way of demonstrating that or relieving the burden from others so that it doesn't all fall on a particular group to, lead these types of practices. And I think that these types of practices are really complementary with restorative justice practices. We've worked with organizations who have said, we want to specifically engage in constructive dialogue techniques first, because it's a great way to build this kind of foundational language and foundational understanding of ourselves, how we process information, where others might be coming from, and really get people on the same page to start to enter into those really important and really challenging conversations.
Well, Erica, I see you've returned, and I think that's our cue to wrap up the Q&A. But I think we got through most of them. Apologies, folks, if we did not have time to get you to your questions, but I encourage you to head on over to the discussion group and continue the conversation there.
It's going to be a good one. Thank you, Joanne. And I will see you shortly in the discussion group. And thank you, Caroline, for just giving us such good information. You got lots of, love in the chat. I'll let you know that. But please share your thoughts on today's webinar. Colleen is sharing a link right now to a brief evaluation in the chat. So would be terrific if you can click on it and you can complete the evaluation later. But I just want you to know, we listen to your feedback and we respond in terms of the topics that we provide for you. And so we appreciate your feedback. Thank you for doing that. I want to talk about next month's webinar because I don't know if you know this, but narratives have the power to influence opportunities for civic health. So I want to invite you to join us next month as we learn more about narrative and how we can use it for good, how we can use that to actually advance equity. We're going to be joined by Gloria Dickerson. She's the founder and CEO of We Together Creating Change. And that's a nonprofit that's located in Drew, Mississippi, which is in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. This city has mastered narrative to create civic participation opportunities for residents. And as a result, lives are changing for the better in Drew. So I want you to come and hear their story and hear how they have used narrative for good. We'll also be joined by Jeanette Raymond with the Minnesota Department of Health, and she's going to be sharing how their health department and their partners are using narrative to change policy. So that's going to be really interesting. So I'm excited. You can go ahead and register for that webinar right now. It's posted on our website, and that'll be on May 23rd. And we typically do not announce guests 2 months out, but we're making an exception this time because we want you to know that in June, we'll be joined by one of public health's true heroes, Dr. Sandro Galea, who is the Dean of the Boston School of Public Health. Some of you may have heard him speak at national conferences. He's awesome. But Dr. Galea is going to join us to break down Public Health 3.0. Have you heard about this framework? It's a framework now that we are now disseminating throughout the public health field because it's helping us be able to reimagine what an equity-centered public health system would look like. So if you're interested in Public Health 3.0 and wanting to know what is your role as an equity advocate and rolling that out, you don't want to miss this webinar. So mark your calendars for June 20th, because we're going to be spending an hour with Dr. Galea, just kind of picking his brains about Public Health 3.0. And then on March 29th, the 2023 county health rankings were released. And if you have not checked out your county snapshot yet, make sure you do it today. We actually have 2 measures that we added to help you understand the strength of civic health in your county. And those 2 measures are voter turnout and census participation. We also have new strategies in our What Works for Health to help you be able to improve civic health in your county. So be sure to check out your snapshot to see where you stand and explore strategies on our website to help you strengthen civic health. And don't forget about our discussion group, which is getting ready to start as soon as we close out the webinar. This is where Caroline's going to join us, and you can share what you're doing in your community around civic participation, specifically constructive dialogue. So Colleen, go ahead and check that out now if you haven't already. And be sure to stay in touch with us through social media and by subscribing to our newsletter. I want to thank Caroline Mehl for sharing her wisdom with us today. I hope to see you in the discussion group, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you for all you do to promote equity in your community. See you next month.